decriminalization, about the taxation, about the impact of public safety. And that's why we have State Representative Kelly Cassidy, who is our champion on this legislation, here today to really discuss the ins and outs of the legislation with us. We will have an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end, and we will be passing out, Shiva, if you could raise your hand, Karen. We will be passing out cards to write your questions on. So if you have a question, if you can just raise your hand, get their attention, and they'll bring you a card so we can ask the questions. So again, I want to welcome you here today. On behalf of myself, I'm Laura Fine, the state senator in the 9th district, Robin Gable, the state representative in the 18th district, and Jennifer von Dershowitz, the representative in the 17th district. And before we begin, I just want to put in a little plug. May 5th, we are having an open house at our office in Glenview and want to invite everybody there. But in the end, today, Robin Gable is going to give announcements about upcoming events. So with no more further ado, I'd like to present Representative Kelly Cassidy.
So I'm going to bounce back and forth and be in charge of my own buttons. So
I can do it.
that's okay. All right. Because I don't really do it on any good rhythm, so it'll just make me move more. So in March of 2017, Senator Heather Staines and I introduced a pair of companion bills on the House and Senate side that were really meant as a conversation piece, a jumping off point to get us to where we're almost at today, which is a comprehensive legislative approach to a tax and regulate scheme for adult use of cannabis. We've held dozens and dozens of town halls, 4 public subject matter hearings, probably approaching north of 100 meetings with stakeholders, from law enforcement to substance abuse providers to the ACLU and everything in between, with the shared objective of getting to the best possible bill for our state. So this is what we're dealing with right now. This is what it looks like here in the U.S. More than 50% of the population lives in a state where some form of cannabis sales are legal. All of the states where adult use is legal were ballot initiatives, with the exception of Vermont, where they actually don't have a marketplace. It's a weird underground process there. And that really speaks to the importance of the work we're doing and the process we've undertaken here in Illinois. States that do it by ballot initiative, it's a pretty small group involved with it. It's the language, it has to fit on your ballot. It's 1 paragraph. And then, then it's up to the legislature to try to interpret what was meant in that paragraph. And that doesn't allow for a great deal of public input at the front end. And so we're really pleased to have been able to go about this in this way, having more folks involved, having a much more deliberative and thoughtful process. So Vermont and DC and now Michigan don't have sales yet. In DC, there's a very strange system whereby if you sign up for an email list, you get notified of these pop-up markets that are referred to as farmers markets. And the product is not necessarily from a regulated system. You don't know what you're getting necessarily. It may be leakage from other states. But because it's illegal to sell, what you do is you buy a sticker or a lighter or a baseball card, and then you get a free sample. That is obviously a less than ideal situation. So Michigan on the November ballot actually did legalize. They're going through their regulatory process now. They're on track. They say they're on track for January of 2020 for sales to begin. Michigan will have home grow of 12 plants and legalized possession of up to 2.5 ounces. So each of us come to this process with a different why. But fundamentally, at its very base, prohibition just hasn't worked. We know that this product is in widespread use. We know that it is very easily accessible on the illicit market. Here in the National Institute of Health do regular surveys of usage rates. And I will start from the place of saying that these surveys, I presume to be pretty conservative numbers. Because when your doctor asks you what your drinking habits are, you say, I have a glass of wine with dinner. Tell them it's a tumbler, right? And so we presume that those numbers are pretty conservative, but what we have here in Illinois is that 780,000 people report regular use of cannabis, and that means within the last month. We have about 58,000 cannabis cards, medical cannabis cards out in the system. That actually doesn't even really indicate 58,000 users within the system, because people who die, people who never use their cards, they don't come off that number. So let's just say we've got about 730,000 people in the state of Illinois purchasing this product on the street, using a product that's not necessarily tested, not necessarily free of contaminants or additives, and really funding some of the violence that we see in our communities. What we also know in states that have legalized is that usage rates don't change dramatically. We see youth use drop, because the guy that slings weed on my corner, I've never once seen him card anyone. But you can't get into a dispensary without showing your ID at least 2 or 3 times. So we see youth use go down, and we see a slight increase in the only demographic where we see the increase is people over 50. It always gets a giggle. And the theory there, frankly, is this is a demographic that's pretty law-abiding, relatively familiar with the product, and their knees hurt. So we talked a bit about youth access. 4 out of 5 teens report that it's very easy to access cannabis, and many report it's easier to access than alcohol. We've not seen increases in states with legalization. Over and over and over again, we actually see that legalization does not link, and you see a decrease. And part of that comes from doing a really thoughtful approach to prevention, and youth prevention in particular. We talk about this all the time, that when we expect our kids, and I've got teenagers, we expect our kids to ace the AP bio exam. But then we put 2 eggs in a frying pan and expect them to respect us when we say that this is your brain on drugs. We can talk to teens about neurotransmitters and addiction pathways and brain development, and they can absorb that, and they can make informed and thoughtful decisions with that information. Colorado has a really robust youth education program, and I think that that's a good deal of why you're seeing steady drops in youth use in Colorado. And then fundamentally, the war on drugs has done significant harm to our communities, and it's so important that we ensure that what we do here makes up for those harms in every way we can. So here's where we are in Illinois. 2015 began the medical cannabis pilot program. Some challenges with that program early on. First of all, just getting off the ground was not easy. We had significant barriers in place for patients that kept our patient count ridiculously low. Michael's laughing. And a governor who hated the program, so did everything he could to keep it from happening. We have the most restrictive list of conditions in the country. Until January of this year, or until last fall, we actually fingerprinted patients before they could get access to the program, which was one of the most offensive things I've seen. The idea that cancer does a criminal background check before it invades your body is mind-blowing. So the medical pilot program it's a pilot program. It has a sunset date on it in 2020, but that's being worked on now. Representative Bob Morgan is carrying that bill, which is kind of a companion to this bill. In July of 2016, actually also in 2015, but it was a bill so nice we had to pass it twice because the runner vetoed it. We did a uniform civil enforcement of cannabis possession. What we discovered was that there was a patchwork of local ordinances. Evanston had one, Chicago had one. They were all over the state related to low-level possession. But there was, first of all, there was discretion. Officers could still decide whether to give a ticket or arrest someone for possession. The amounts, the quantities you could possess varied, the ticket amounts varied, and whether you could get more than one ticket ever varied. So we sought to create a uniform playing field. and remove that discretion. So since July of 2016, possession of less than 10 grams of cannabis has come with a ticket that is expungible upon payment of the ticket, and there's no discretion in terms of whether you get a ticket or arrest. We took arrest off the table for that low-level possession. And then last year, we passed the Alternative to Opioids Act to create access to the medical cannabis program for patients who would prefer that access to an opioid prescription, knowing as we did that, or as we do, that addiction to opioids can set in within days. We certainly didn't want to put folks in the line that patients were waiting in for 100, 120 days to get their cards. So we actually got rid of the line for everybody and created this immediate access. That rolled out at the end of January, and we're starting to see some good success there. So to our medical cannabis program, there are 21 licensed indoor cultivation facilities, 20 are operational, none of them really at capacity because our program is so small. 60 dispensaries were approved, there are 55 operational, and we're trying to figure out with the governor's office how to get those 5 licenses out into underserved communities as quickly as possible. So what you see in this photo is an early stage grow room at an Illinois cultivator. From the time a plant is 4 inches tall, it's given a barcode that carries it to harvest and into the product marketplace. So we are always able, from seed to sale, to track this product in terms of contaminants. If there's a recall necessary, we're able to do that. And the other thing that happens with that is that the level of regulation that our growers operate under is pretty amazing. When you go into one of these facilities, they don't even take out the garbage without it being inspected. So everything is watched from the minute that you walk into that building. And that is why when we talk to law enforcement around the country, and even our law enforcement here, even the ones that aren't in support of our bill, they will acknowledge that our product is not being found on the streets in other states, but product from other states is on the streets here. We have a mix of independent, locally owned operators, but a lot of national entities working in multiple states. In fact, a lot of the bigger operators are actually based in Illinois. They started here and have grown from here. There is virtually no minority representation in Illinois, or really otherwise. There's the guesstimate is about 4% minority ownership around the country in the cannabis industry. That's something that keeps me up at night. It offends me. It's something we want to fix for. It's something we want to get right here in Illinois. Part of the issue here in Illinois is that the records of ownership are sealed. They're not publicly available. And so one of the things we are correcting for is making sure that those license holders are identifiable by the public. And the background on that, when the medical cannabis law went into effect, there was a desire to protect the applications from scrutiny in that, so let's say Jen and I are both applying for a license. I shouldn't be able to grab her application and get a competitive advantage. That's reasonable. They forgot to lift that veil, and so those remain sealed. So we want to make sure we lift that seal. So our proposal, in a nutshell, will allow residents 21 and over to purchase up to 30 grams, which is roughly an ounce. Non-residents are limited to 15 grams. That's pretty standard across the country, although as I mentioned in Michigan, that's going to be 2.5 ounces. The bill still contemplates home grow for folks 21 and over, 5 plants per household. This is one of the areas, when we set out to do this, we started talking to folks around the country who'd been through this, and we asked a set of questions to everyone that we work with around the country. What do you wish you had done differently? What do you wish you hadn't done at all? What do you wish you'd been able to do? Home grow came up a lot, in particular from the folks in Colorado. Again, it's a ballot initiative state. The right to grow and possess cannabis is enshrined in the Colorado Constitution, limiting the ability of the legislature to do much about it. And what they did is allow, it was 6 plants per person, there wasn't a household cap, and it also allowed this caregiver proxy system whereby people could, I could be the proxy grower for everybody in this room. You could come into a warehouse, and so law enforcement would come into warehouses that looked like that grow that I showed you, that wouldn't be a licensed grow, but I would be there as the grower, but I'm the caregiver for all of my friends in Evanston. So that made regulation really challenging, and so that's one of the pieces we correct for with a pretty strict limit of 5 plants per household. There will likely be some more changes to that because this is the area of the most controversy. This is where we get the most pushback on this, and so you know, I hear from activists a lot that this is the most important thing to them. Make sure you tell your legislators that, because all they're hearing is that law enforcement hates it. It will, you know, we'll go to hell in a handbasket if we have home grow. So, just putting that out there. Public consumption will remain illegal. You know, the DUI, which we actually addressed DUI in the ticket bill because Illinois had been a zero tolerance state, which actually made it hard for a charge to stick because you can scientifically prove that the substance stays in your body long after impairment's gone. So we adopted the standards used by Colorado and Washington, which allows for a blood or saliva test in the presence of THC in the system. There are new tests out there. We're reviewing some of the research to see how we need to update that to stay ahead of the curve. It remains the most challenging bit on the enforcement side because of the fundamental differences between alcohol and cannabis. Everybody wants this to fit into a .08 box. It doesn't. But we got to get as close as we can to that. Impairment is impairment. If you are showing evidence of impairment, that remains a standard. Again, back to the issue of those 730,000 people who are consuming the product. Every single sky is falling story that can be told about what will happen, what terrible thing that will happen if we legalize this product is happening today. These folks are using the product, they're buying it on the illegal market, we don't know what's in it, we don't know how it's been grown, and they're driving, they're doing all of the things, and we're not addressing it properly. We're pretending it's not happening. So we're working on making the DUI law a little bit more responsive. And then in terms of local government issues, a couple of pieces. In the medical cannabis program, we defined the locations really, really strictly. In terms of setbacks from various things. You can't be within 200 feet of a daycare center or a park or this or that or the other thing. The reality is 150 or 250 feet in Chicago or Evanston is very, very different than 150 feet in Taylorville. And so what we want to roll that back and allow locals to have a better chance to define what works for their community. I live in Rogers Park, one of the most liberal communities in the state. There were 2 pieces of property that could qualify to be a dispensary location. By the time the guy got possession of the property and his license, a daycare center had moved in across the street and he had to start all over again. And it took him 2 years to get open, but he finally opened last May. When I visited him in July, he had 48 registered patients in his facility. He's doing better now, it's growing. But I think we need to do a better job of allowing communities to define what works for them. So the law will be a little more flexible with regard to those locations. That will also allow some of the more job-concentrated facilities, like grow facilities, to perhaps locate more in northern Illinois. Most of them are south of I-80 because of the setback requirements. The one thing, we want to make sure that locals have access to the buildings for safety and law enforcement reasons. That's something that exists under current law, but we're restating it to make it very clear because some locals have been uncertain if they have that access. And then the only thing that will be set in stone in terms of locations is to avoid that liquor store on every corner kind of concept, that undue concentration. We will require that they be a minimum of 1,500 feet away from other cannabis-related businesses. So what you see in that photo is one of the actual labels on a product, and I actually forgot to bring a container. I usually have a couple containers that I pass around so folks can see. This is not your granddad's film canister or Ziploc baggie. And in fact, in how many of these that we've done, somebody's only gotten it open once, and that person was a patient. They were cheating. They're really hard to get open. So within the proposal, employers and landlords will still be able to have a zero tolerance policy. The employer one is one that comes up a lot from both sides. Patients are really struggling right now with that issue. There are competing court cases moving through the system, and ultimately that's going to be sorted out by the courts. They've broken both ways in terms of whether an employer can discipline a medical cannabis patient for having the product in their system. We have very, very strict packaging and advertising rules that we're actually increasing the strictness on. Making sure that there's language in there about warnings about youth use and warnings about pregnant women. There's already regulations about being appealing to children. They can't be, no cartoon characters, that kind of stuff. No gummy bears. They're squares. They're all individually wrapped products. And I talked about not being able to open the product. The product rules are pretty intense as well. But that barcode that I referred to, that will get you all the way back to that 4-inch plant. So you'll be able to see what it was treated with, what it was tested for, the potency of the product. Some of them now have time to activation on them, and I think that we're going to make that part of the requirement. One of the issues around the country has been concerns and confusion about edibles. When folks are unfamiliar with a product, I'm going to eat one square of this chocolate that I don't feel anything immediately, and the next thing you know, you've eaten a whole chocolate bar and you do not feel well. And so, that was one of the Colorado things, one of the wishes that we heard from in Colorado. They've pretty much corrected for it there. Now things have to be scored in single serving product, placements. They have to be labeled properly. You have to know exactly how much is in each dose, and you get public education when you purchase an edible. And so that was another one of those nightmare stories that has largely corrected itself with public education and proper labeling. But we continue to work through that. Landlords can prohibit use, condo buildings can prohibit use, just like you could be pet-free or smoke-free. Those things remain in place. So we get a lot of talk about how much money is it going to bring in, what can we do with it. We're going to solve all of our problems with cannabis. We're not. Plain and simple. It's not going to solve the state's problems. It's not going to solve Chicago's problems. It's not going to solve Evanston's problems. It's real money, but it's not a miracle. This is not a magic ATM. And to be perfectly honest, states that went about it for the money, if you put the money first, you end up with less money, and you end up with a stronger street market. So we've got to be very careful not to overtax it. Most states actually had to go back and reduce their tax rates. Because what they found was that they were not cutting into the street market. When we went out to Colorado a little more than a year ago, we met with the Boulder County, or the then Boulder County District Attorney, and he shared a cautionary tale. His community, pretty affluent, not a lot of fiscal challenges. They didn't choose to add a local tax to the product. They were happy with the local government distribution, the piece of the pie that they got from the state, didn't add that local tax, and their street market all but disappeared. In neighboring Pueblo County, lots of challenges there, lots of fiscal pressures. They went to the max on the local tax, and their street market grew. So mindful of that, and for the city officials in the room, I would recommend waiting a year before you add a local tax. Let people get habituated into the legal marketplace. You'll end up with more revenue in that way. In November of 2018, the Illinois Economic Policy Institute, which is a nonpartisan and agnostic on the issue, issued a report on what sort of impact legal sale of cannabis is likely to have. They estimated $525 million in new tax revenue, and that assumes that all consumers will immediately switch to the legal marketplace. And that's just simply not what happens. It takes time to get people to make the switch. 24,000 new jobs will be created in 2,600 businesses. So, you know, we've had estimates of 350 to 700 million. 500 million seems like a decent place to put a pin. Under the medical program now, there are about 2,000 people licensed to touch the plant, so employed in the industry. Ancillary businesses are nothing to sneeze at. That's something to be mindful of as well. So, you know, we talk a lot about the licensed businesses and how much money folks are making in the licensed cannabis industries, as the growers, as the sellers. The reality is, we had a hearing on economic development, one of our 4 public hearings. We had a whole panel on ancillary industries. We had one guy whose family business for decades had been supplying CO2 to soda fountains. And he started becoming the CO2 provider because that's one of the products you use to extract from the plant to create the distillates. And his business is, I think, quadrupled in size. An accountant, that was another guy. He, again, small farm accountant kind of guy. He dealt with ag businesses. He can't hire fast enough to keep up with the growth. And he also said, as an aside, my cannabis industry folks are way more compliant with the laws than any of my farmers are. Again, you know, we don't want to put the money first, but we do have to talk about it. One of the first things the first regulator from Colorado said, spend on the program first. Make sure that you scale up your regulatory scheme in a way that allows it to keep up with the growth. And that's critically important because let's go back to the fact that we talk about not having any incidences of leakage from our system in the state of Illinois. That is because we are so highly regulated, because these folks are inspected by the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Professional Regulation every week, because they can't throw out their garbage without it being checked, because we track that from seed to sale. We have to make sure that we invest and grow scale that up in a way that can keep up with the growth. Want to make sure that we talk about that public education component, that we talk about that youth use, we talk about the reasons why you might not want to use this product, and that has to be a big part of what we do. We have neglected our mental health and substance abuse treatment community for many, many years, in the last 4 years in particular, but we've not been good about it for quite some time, so it's appropriate for some of these funds to go there. Law enforcement impairment training and equipment is another piece. And then fundamentally, and this is my why, this is the hill I'm going to die on, I want to make sure that we're reinvesting in communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs. We have disproportionately policed communities, pretty much out of existence in some cases. We want to make sure that we are doing that in a way that puts those communities at the forefront and they're able to rebuild in the ways that matter to them. You know, I'm not going to be the nice white lady on the north side saying, you know, Englewood needs a mental health system and, you know, East St. Louis needs a new school. That's for East St. Louis and Englewood to say. It's really important to us that we have it done in a way that is driven by the communities. So to the DUI part, we talked about this a little bit. We're not going to change the standards for impairment because that hasn't changed on the research level. We have used NHTSA, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, standards that allow us to test for THC in blood and saliva. That saliva is a relatively new technology. It's being tested in one community here in Carroll Stream where you can do a roadside cheek swab. That's not going to give us a large enough sample to be useful. We just got one. We'll get to questions. We just got a new study out of Michigan that was done in a more broad way. And so we're interested to see, and I'll be honest with you, haven't read it yet. Just came in yesterday. So that's one that we're hopeful can help us get a better handle on it. To transport the product, it has to be in a closed, sealed container that does not emit odor, and that's how you buy them. When you come out of a dispensary, they're sealed up well. There are a lot of challenges around the DUI thing. There's very little pre-legalization data. I mean, we're lucky in that we put the nanogram per deciliter standard in a couple of years ago so that we'll have some data to work from. But a lot of times you'll hear, DUI is going to be the terrible thing because in Colorado, DUIs increased by 400% the year after legalization. Well, the reality is they didn't track it before legalization. So when you read these studies, it's really, really important to read the data, not just the headlines. If you didn't test it in the year before and then in the year after there are 4, that is in fact a 400% increase, except it isn't. And so it's really important that we dig in and look at this stuff in a critical and thoughtful way. Back to the issue of how it's metabolized and how it's stored in the system. And fundamentally, we are mindful of the needs of law enforcement around this issue. We know, as I said, 730,000 people are using this product on the streets today. We're not dealing with it well. We're not dealing with it thoughtfully. We want to make sure that we are dealing with it well and dealing with it thoughtfully and giving law enforcement the tools they need to address impairment. So to the issue of the restorative justice component, and for me, it's a 3-legged stool. We have to approach this in this way, and if anybody imagines that 3-legged stool, if all the legs aren't even, you can't sit on it. It won't work. So the first leg is restoration of records. We want to expunge criminal records in a way that is as close to automatic as is humanly possible. And I say it in that way because the record keeping in the state of Illinois is stunningly bad. We have some counties that are fully automated and it would be really easy to pull the records and do the expungement. Unfortunately, Cook is not one of those counties. We joke sometimes that Cook County is the last large institutional user of carbon paper in our court system. So that's going to be a challenge. Luckily, State's Attorney Fox is actually undertaking this already in advance of us doing this. She's working with an organization called Code for America that is creating algorithms to pull these records in a way that will allow us to automate the process more. States that have done this expungement and done it in a way that relies on the traditional method of people having to petition for expungement have seen very low participation rates. California had a 1% participation rate, and all you had to do was mail in a postcard. You actually didn't even have to jump through a lot of hoops. But what we've learned from that is that folks don't necessarily know that they're eligible. If you're arrested 10 years ago and you've got 5 charges on you, and your public defender says if you plead guilty to this misdemeanor, you get to go home, you don't know which one you pled guilty to 10 years later. You don't necessarily know that you have an expungible cannabis charge. Because on that day, maybe you had a gun on you, maybe you had stolen something from the store, maybe you had, all that 5 could be any number of things, and all you know is that you got to go home. And you don't necessarily know that you're eligible for expungement. So we need to make sure that we do a better job, that we do the footwork on that. We want to make sure that we remove the barrier to employment that exists. You can't be an owner or an employee of any of the regulated cannabis businesses if you have any background at all. We want to make sure that we remove that barrier. Second leg of the stool, access and equity. As I talked about, the industry currently is largely white and largely male. We don't see a lot of minority representation. We don't even see a lot of women represented. That's any of the business enterprises that we try to support in the state of Illinois. So the current program, the medical cannabis program, has 2 license categories: cultivators and dispensaries. Cultivators do the growing, the processing, and the distribution of the product. By processing, that's creating the extracts, creating the edibles. Your grandmother may have the best brownie recipe in the world, and you figured out how to infuse it. Unless you're friends with a cultivator and can get into their business space, you can't get that product to market. So we want to correct for some of that. So we want to create 3 new layers of licensing to allow more opportunities for access to the industry, hopefully with a lower bar to entry. So right now, to build out a cultivator, it's $10 to $12 million for one of those spaces. To build out a dispensary, it's $1 to $2 million at minimum. And that also means, frankly, let's reference the guy in Rogers Park who had to hold this property for multiple years before he could even get close to being open. So there's a lot of upfront costs while you work through the licensing process. So we want to create a craft grow, which frankly is what I envision will be able to be more easily located in more populated areas. If you contemplate some of the places you might drive through where you see these shuttered manufacturing facilities, this is a great opportunity to bring real jobs and real economic development into a community. So craft grower is a smaller footprint, under 10,000 square feet, under lights. Processor or infuser, back to your grandmother's brownies. Right now, the only edible products, the only infused products available are the ones being made by those cultivators. So there's not a lot of opportunity for innovation and entrepreneurship in this industry, and I see this as one of the greatest spots for that to be able to play out. And then a transportation license. That's not home delivery. That is actually the task of getting the product from the cultivator to the processor to the dispensary and back again. And also to move the cash. That's one of the biggest challenges the industry is facing right now. They're largely unbanked, although we're working on that. There's a lot of cash moving around, and that can get a little scary for folks. The cultivators right now are doing the transport, and they, first of all, the requirements on the vehicle, because you want to have some serious security in place. There's multiple steps of security there. They have to file their route with the state police 24 hours in advance. They're constantly tracked by GPS. We intend for those regulations to apply to the transporters, but we also envision that as this industry grows, they may want to job that out. They may not want to be in the business of moving the product anymore. They want to put their time into creating the product. So creating that added layer will allow for a more accessible entry point to the industry. So right now, again, under this veil of secrecy that we have, we know that the applicants had to provide diversity plans, but there's been no accountability or follow-up on those, and they're not accessible because of that protection from public records. So we want to make sure that as we move forward, we're not baking in the inequity to the current system. We want to make sure that we're holding the current industry accountable and making sure that they are part of the solution. Want to make sure that we hold them accountable to those diversity plans now, the ones that they did put in place. Want to make sure that becomes a real community benefits plan, where it's not just what your employer, what your ownership structure looks like, or even your employment structure, but what are you doing for the community you're in? How are you making things better for the place that you're operating? Want to make sure that they are part of an incubation model that helps bring people up and into the industry. And fundamentally, again, why do we only have 4% participation around the country? I think that a lot of states have tried a lot of interesting things. No state has gotten it right, largely because I think they've all looked at it as a singular problem with a singular solution. And that makes some really terrible assumptions, frankly. Not everyone's barrier to access to the industry is a criminal record. Not everyone's barrier to access to the industry is access to capital or a skill set. It's perhaps some combination of those things. And so our solution has to be that same buffet. It has to address those pieces in the varying degrees that the folks trying to get into the industry require. So making sure that we've got good job training programs, making sure that we've got mentorship programs, making sure we're doing diversity job fairs, making sure that they're investing in their communities. And finally, that third stool of the leg is to address that harm that we've seen to communities that have been over-policed and impacted by the war on drugs. So we want to create the Restoring Our Communities program. We've worked very closely with our Black and Latino caucuses in both chambers to come up with this idea. This is something that hasn't been done anywhere yet, and we're very excited about it. We want to focus assistance on those communities that have high degrees of poverty and violence, historical overuse of criminal justice response. Allow through the construction of an inclusive community-based board those needs and projects to be determined at the local level. And then it says here, communities that opt out of the industry will not be eligible for ROC funds. And that's very much true. We are allowing local governments to opt out just as they currently can, but we also want to make clear that if you opt out of the benefits too. If you don't want to be part of the solution, you don't get to be. So we have been in working groups and negotiation sessions with stakeholders led by the governor's office. We're getting very close to a final product. We've all met a few times. The working groups are going to have another set of meetings this week, and we'll be ready to file a revised bill that reflects all of the feedback we've gotten over the course of the last couple of years. We want to create a timeline for implementation that ensures that the agencies are able to get the administrative rules in place, to get the licenses out the door, to get the folks up and running. I still think that a goal of January 1, 2020 for going to market is realistic but incredibly ambitious. I also just don't like to lose, and so I want to be ahead of Michigan. And then again, back to that tax strategy, making sure that we're doing it in a thoughtful way that doesn't put us in a position of overtaxing. And then figuring out where those monies will go and which buckets are key. And then we've got questions coming. So this is how to stay plugged in. If you follow Legalize Illinois on Facebook or Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter at Rep. Kelly Cassidy. These organizations have been our partners in this: Marijuana Policy Project, Illinois and Chicago NORML. We are pushing out updates as often as we can so that folks can stay engaged. And now we've got some questions coming. Okay. You want to? I can do it. You can do it. Whatever you want. Okay. Yep. So what I find is there are about 10 given questions on this, and they fall into a set of categories. So I was just double checking there weren't any repeats. I'm a patient in the state's medical cannabis program. How will legalization affect patients who are in the system right now? Thank you for asking that. I always try to remember to say this, and I forgot to say this. States that have gone to adult use, almost every state has had a shortage of product for patients on day one. We are including in our program that the cultivators and the dispensaries have to hold back product based on what they know their patients need. Again, back to how strict our system is. They know exactly who's buying what, and they know how many times a week they buy it. So they are able to conform to that, and we're putting that in the law. Has Colorado eliminated its illicit market? Last numbers I had were that their illegal marketplace had been reduced by 75%, and those numbers are kind of old. I think we see it varies in different communities. I talked about Boulder versus Pueblo. It depends on how you're operating. We have not eliminated our entire illicit marketplace for alcohol or cigarettes either. You're never going to completely eliminate it, but we want to cut into it as much as we can. I'm hearing about well-funded opposition groups descending on the legislators in Springfield attempting to spread fear and hesitation concerning adult use legislation. What is actually happening, and how is this negative information being handled? So, I talked a little bit about, looking at the data, knowing the data, seeing it for what it is. There's a lot of that. We see a lot of studies saying, these terrible things are going to happen. The answer to every sky is falling story goes back to those 730,000 people who are using the product today, and it's way more than 730,000, by the way. They're using it today, those problems exist today, and we're not doing anything about it. This will allow us to address this head on and in an honest and thoughtful way. Has any thought been given to restrict revenue collected to a specific use, such as education or pension debt? Lottery funds were supposed to be used to fund education, but have not. That is part of the conversation. Again, you know, we're not talking about enough money to solve any singular problem. But there is, part of the discussion has been, do we want to dedicate some percentage of the revenues to the pension debt or the or back bills or something like that, and that remains part of the ongoing conversation. What documentation will buyers have to provide, and how might this impact access by undocumented residents in our communities? So there'll be no tracking of purchasers in terms of storage of data, but you will have to have a valid ID, just as you would have to buy alcohol. An estimate of losses to street market job, no.
Sorry, net new, my question.
Okay, what? Not new? I don't know what you mean.
Net new, meaning you talked about the jobs
Yeah.
created. There will ostensibly be jobs lost
Right.
in the street markets. Do you understand what the net new number of jobs will be?
No.
Okay.
I mean, there's no data to base it on in terms of how many people are working in the street market. No.
Although we could look at the incarceration rate.
Right, you could definitely look at the incarceration rate, but in terms of, you know, what I do know is that when we did the expungement study, we pulled a random 10-year sample of folks who would be impacted just by the felony level charges that we're looking at, not the misdemeanor level charges. It's 7,500 people over the course of 10 years had a class 4 felony, either for possession or possession with intent, and that's statewide. So that can give us some idea, but the misdemeanor numbers are impossible to gather because they're all locally held, so it's a lot harder. Impaired driving is already a huge threat, drunk and distracted driving. You addressed it from an enforcement perspective, but isn't public education more important? Example, don't drink and drive. Absolutely, and that is part of the discussion around public education. We just saw a new package coming out of Colorado around all of that. That was really, really good. Students for Sensible Drug Policy brought it to us, and it was very cool. So that you can have an impact. I mean, an interesting perspective on that. My 17-year-old son, we were driving to school one day, and there was an Uber or Lyft ad on a bus shelter, and it said something about, you know, driving while drug driving or buzz driving or whatever. And he looked at me and he's like, "Mommy, I don't understand. Why do people even bother driving when they're going to drink? It's so stupid." So, you know, we do make huge impacts on youth when we do it in a thoughtful way. Littering is another great example. It's one we bring up all the time because kids don't throw garbage on the ground, because we did a pretty good job of that. Smoking is another example. You can change behavior that way. Therapeutic range for DUI, rec, and medical. I don't know what that means. Yeah.
Is there going to be a therapeutic range for like medicinal patients?
No.
Okay.
It's still a problem. The issue remains that it stays in your system, and regular users are going to hold the product in their system longer than others. It's still an issue that's not been solved nationally.
Yeah, because I was just wondering, because with prescription medications, there's therapeutic ranges, and you can't.
But impairment is impairment too, so that still remains the standard. If you are impaired, you're impaired.
Okay.
Yeah. Are you concerned with big cannabis taking over? Any plan to prevent that? So let's be clear. I'm going to start from the fact that big cannabis is that guy on my corner slinging weed. They're here. They're everywhere. The reality of big cannabis, we are a capitalist society. That's what our laws do. They support business coming in. And as I mentioned, a lot of the multi-state operators started out as independent operators here in Illinois, which is kind of interesting to see. Some of the biggest folks started as one license holder here in Illinois. That said, we are incentivizing local ownership. We are doing everything we can to ensure that small business has a leg up. That said, there's nothing you can do to prevent somebody from cashing in and selling their license and making money. You know, and that's how these big operators become big operators. They come in and they buy the small guys. Is there any provision within the legislation that addresses certification of dispensary workers? Yeah, we are actually adding that. Just like we have to have training for folks who work as bartenders and servers, we are adding that. That wasn't in place prior under the medical program, but that's something we are adding in. Will the bill require education for parents who smoke pot regarding keeping their pot? That's already in the law. It has to be kept in a locked container, a locked space away from children. Ditto with the plants. So keeping the product out of the reach of kids. The requirement is that it does have to be locked away, and the plants would as well. They'd have to be behind a locked door. How can we be sure the funds are being allocated properly and used properly and not swept like the lottery? We have language preventing the sweeping of the funds in the bill. Have you considered reserving a percentage of licenses for disinvested communities and potential owners there? Yes, except that direct of a way of doing it gets thrown out in court. So if you have an actual set aside, like in Ohio it happened, it's happened in a couple of other states, then they get challenged, it gets thrown out in court, and then there's nothing. So you have to do it in a way that is data driven and based on fact. We are actually in the middle of a disparity study, which we like to refer to as a privilege study, to get a handle on the realities of the industry so that we can use that as well as data on communities and the impact of the war on drugs on communities to target licensure in that way. States that have done a straight up set aside have found their laws thrown out.
You have to write my question on. I do.
Why not allow clusters of businesses in an area? Every other industry has clusters in Illinois: auto dealers, coffee shops, restaurants in Evanston, grocery stores. But we actually regulate things like liquor stores in that way all over the state. And so it really is about that undue concentration. Some neighborhoods in Denver, it's all there is. And that tends to drive out other businesses. So you want to make sure you have a good balance. These can be drivers of economic growth. They can be drivers of other businesses coming in, but you have to do it thoughtfully. What is your true cannabis interest? Personal use, business incentive, medicinal use, or tax revenue? Frankly, for me, it's an issue of social justice. We've gone about this all wrong. We are harming people with the way we operate today. This is about righting a wrong. How to handle the mental impairment of cannabis use. So I'm thinking you may be referencing a story that broke a week or so ago that links it was cannabis use, but the way they just high potency cannabis use, regular use of high potency cannabis to schizophrenia. The study itself actually says that there is no causal link that they were able to find. Correlation is not causation. What we don't know about the folks in that study was if they were already predisposed to schizophrenia. We don't have any of that data available. What we still know, broken record, 730,000 people are using this product today without any studies, follow-up, or thoughtful addressing of the issues. Am I seeing much pushback from other lawmakers in the state? There's some, and for some it's really, prohibitionists are going to prohibit. If that is what you believe in, then you're going to push for that. But for the most part, even with folks who are not enthusiastic supporters, we've had really good and thoughtful conversations about the fact that, quite frankly, this is coming. This is going to happen, whether we do it this year or it happens at the end of the line when the federal government changes the laws. It's coming. And the best way for us to address that is to do it in this thoughtful and deliberative way that brings us to the forefront, allows us to be a leader around the country. My goal is for this bill to be the model that other states base their system on. When we were, right before the election, we were down in St. Louis meeting with the Post-Dispatch editorial board. about this issue. And they came to, they had 3 medical cannabis questions on their ballot for November, because they're a ballot initiative state in St. Louis. And so they asked us some questions about that, and right before the election, they ran an editorial with the headline, "Why can't we just do what Illinois is doing?" That's my goal. I want us to draw the blueprints that other states can use. Female-owned businesses, how do we get in, and is there
A written plan.
a written plan? So that is going into the bill. And that's what I was talking about in terms of having to set up doing that privilege study to establish the need to do more for, under the law, you have to have a reason to benefit any one group, or it will get thrown out in court. And so this is going into the bill in a way that we believe will sustain court challenges. In other states, they've been challenged in ways that have had it all thrown out.
So I have another question to that. So your plan is not written, right?
It will be. It's in the process of being written now. The bill, as I mentioned, we anticipate having a fully written bill by the end of the month.
Okay, so once that plan is written, will we be able to get it so that?
Absolutely.
What you're looking for so that we can?
Absolutely. It becomes a public record at that point. There have been competing white papers about the supply and demand of cannabis in Illinois. Can you comment on this? Yeah, so we did one using a firm out of Colorado. We commissioned a demand study using a firm out of Colorado that does not work for the industry ever. Their business model is to consult to governments, and they did a study that showed that the current industry, the established industry, could not in any way, shape, or form meet the anticipated demand of a full adult use marketplace. Illinois Normal did one that aligned pretty closely with ours in terms of the ability of the industry to meet the demand. The industry hired a company that only consults to the industry, and they came out with a study that said that they could meet the demand for 4 years before we needed any new licenses. Yeah. And let's be clear, even if they could meet the demand for 4 years without new licenses, doesn't mean that they get to have a monopoly for 4 years. That's simply not going to happen. Yeah. Will federal laws supersede states' regulations if the federal government passes legislation? The federal bills that are being considered right now are really about ensuring that states are free to do what they need to do. So that banking is an option. Right now we have a lot of problems with the industry having access to banking services. So right now it's called the SAFE Act. It just had a hearing last week, 2 weeks, Rose? 1 week ago? It's like dog years. So there was the first ever hearing on this issue in Congress, and advanced the bill that will allow for states to operate in this space without interference from the federal government. I was on a panel in December with some folks that were working on the federal bill. They talked about that bill being fast-tracked and described that as meaning in a year or two. We fast-track differently here. What specifically is done to limit financial barriers to ownership of dispensaries? Again, back to what we described, we want to make sure that there are loan funds available, whether that comes from the existing industry paying into a fund, whether that's set-asides of the tax money, to make sure that we have access to capital addressed in a way that works. Provisions in the bill to make access to medical marijuana easier for veterans. So we already have in the medical program a process by which veterans who get their health care through the federal VA can bypass their physician by simply bringing their diagnosis to the dispensary. So that we anticipate that that will remain in place. When we did the opioid alternative bill, we actually missed ticking and tying those together, so we need to add in that they can also bring their opioid prescription to the dispensary and use that to gain access to the program. That's another piece of federal law that's moving through relatively slowly, is addressing that in a more comprehensive way. That's the best workaround we can do. Firearms. Can people who work in the cannabis industry still get concealed carry or own firearms? It's really not about working in the industry, honestly. What we had happen when we first rolled out the medical cannabis program was the state police actually were sending revocation letters to folks who had medical cannabis cards and firearm owners' ID cards, and that's based on a federal issue. The ATF makes Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms makes reference to addictive substances in their prohibitors. And because cannabis at the federal level is a Schedule I drug, which is no medical benefit and is only an addictive substance, then they were interpreting that to mean that you were ineligible to own a firearm. Ironically enough, having received several awards from the Brady Fund and from the Illinois Council Against Handgun Violence, I actually was the one who stepped up and stood up for these the medical patients who were fighting to keep keep access to their weapons. The compromise position of the state police was that they still can have their FOID cards, but they can't make any more purchases on from a federal firearm dealer. They can only actually utilize the private sale loophole that we try to close on the regular. And what you see out west is a lot of folks don't get their medical cards, and they just purchase through the adult use market. So that's one that's going to have to be solved at the federal level by descheduling. Once it's descheduled, that problem goes away. What are the plans to address the increased amount of homeless people that come to Illinois because marijuana will be legalized? More homeless people flocking to states that legalize the drug. It's actually just not true. There's no data to support that homelessness rates increase. I think Colorado did see a little bit, but it was a novelty at that point. It was the only state, and I don't think that it was anything truly measurable. So it's just not a thing. I'm aware of horror stories involving child-parent separation when mothers have tested positive for cannabis after birth. What type of clinical to child and family services pushback approval have you experienced? Not really heard this so much around cannabis, other drugs, and this is an area that Robin works in a lot as well. We are putting language in the bill around discrimination in the foster care system and things like that to protect for that. You want to add on the
So I do have a bill that will delete that clause in the law, which if a newborn is found to have any drugs in its system, it automatically gets reported to DCFS. Problem with that is that then moms and babies don't want to get tested. And it's also, the main piece about that is that it's been very discriminatory in who gets tested and who doesn't get tested. We have found that that minorities get tested 4 times more likely for drugs. All those studies done many years ago show that both white and black and everybody uses drugs at the same rate. But who gets tested and whose families get disrupted. So we're trying to take that line out of the law completely, and we are trying to put in a new piece, which is informed consent. So it would be the same informed consent that you have to give to get tested for anything. And it would be, they talk to the mom and say, mom delivering a baby and say, listen, we'd like to test you. This is what the benefits would be to being tested, you and your baby. You would get treatment, the baby would get treatment, and nobody would get sent to DCFS, nobody would get sent to jail. So we're hoping that with that kind of a law that people would be more likely to consent, and then we wouldn't have the issue of babies not getting tested. And also we're hoping to be able to find more babies that might be, that the drugs might be passed to that we don't even know about. So if we do informed consent for everyone, that makes a lot more sense.
So about a question about young women using cannabis and getting pregnant and the effect on both children and the unborn. That is one of the pieces we're adding to the labeling and to the public education is around pregnancy and childbirth and impact on youth. So that's something that's being addressed currently. So I want to thank everybody. Done these all over the state. I'm on the verge of killing a car over this bill, so being able to come within a couple miles of home was pretty sweet. So thank you guys for having me.
Thank you. And we really appreciate that you are leading on this. And what do we think about the possibilities of this bill passing this year?
So that is our goal, to pass the bill this year. The reality of Springfield is that I've seen the wheels come off of things that are easier to pass. And we are mindful of what just happened in both New Jersey and New York, where they felt like they were greased and ready to go. The difference between us and them is that we've spent 2 years laying this groundwork in a really deliberate way, so I still feel like we're on track.
Good. Well, we're going to try very hard to get this passed. So thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. This was a great turnout. We just want to let you know that we are having an event Tuesday, April 16th, just a couple weeks from now, 7 to 8:30 in the evening at the Evanston Public Library. It is going to be a session led by Ralph Mateer from the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability on the state of Illinois budget and pensions. I know that you are all thrilled to hear that, but there are a lot of people who write me every day who are concerned about our budget and concerned about our pensions. So I think it will be extremely informative. Ralph has a great way of making those topics incredibly interesting. So I encourage you to come Tuesday, April 16th. The three of us again are sponsoring this. And please let's give Kelly another round of applause.